to remedy this improper and unreasonable, unjust state of affairs, we are scornfully told that the word agriculture is not in the Constitution of the United States. We might retort, neither is the word lawyer. We might very properly reply, if then the word agriculture is not in the Constitution of the people of whom we are a majority, then we mean to put it there. If we as a class possess no rights as a majority, nevertheless we possess all the rights and all power under the Constitution of the government as they stand. And he goes on to talk about the need to form a Department of Agriculture. Then quoting briefly again from a speech in 1884, farmers and mechanics, laborers and producers of every class, brothers in the common cause, let us stand as one man to oppose the corruption and monopoly and oppression, in whatever form they come and by whosoever name they may be called, whatsoever disguise they may assume. Organize, I beg you, organize. Without organization, you cannot cope with the trained legions of monopoly. Organize, organize, or they will tread you in the dust beneath their feet. That was 1884 at Nashville. And again in 1885. We have not claimed to have grievances, but rights. There are legislative measures and administrative reforms essential not only to the best interests of our calling, but to the well-being of the nation. A majority of the people must carry them against the rings and monopolies, corrupt and shameless, and their astute attorneys, who in cahoots with the political bosses have so long misgoverned this country. And so in 1977, when we went to Washington, we continued that agenda, feeling that it had been forgotten and neglected for 25 years, particularly since the Stegall Amendment of 1942 had been allowed to pass out of existence, in part because Harry Truman preferred to listen to the bankers at the end of his administration than to the people in his own Council of Economic Advisors who understood the importance of the family farm to maintain the health underneath our entire national economy. But the crowning capstone on the Stegall Amendment and the restoration of control of economic policy to the bankers was the appointment of Ezra Taft Benson as Secretary of Agriculture. And we pursued then the gradual decline by which farmers were squeezed out, the farm labor to go into the cities and into the industries at low wages, and food and fiber resources supposedly to keep the engine of industry in this country turning. We returned to the same fundamental philosophy that had governed the economics of this country under the administrations of Coolidge and Hoover and the leadership of such as Andrew Mellon in the as the Secretary of Treasury in those years. The strike was simply, or we very soon began to be aware that it had to be just a symbol. We hoped to keep the threat of it alive long enough to get some legislation in Washington, but we knew that the mentality in the farm economy was such that as soon as some farmers talked about holding back, there were others who were ready to plant fence row to fence row to make some money on the expected price rise that they saw coming. Because this is the way the situation has trained us to think. We had 5 points when we went to Washington, and I have copies of that for those who are interested. But the main thrust was to get price back into agriculture. And so we wrote a bill. At first we went and we said, it's up to you to write the bill, senators and members of the Congress. We don't know how to do that. Many of our people thought that all we had to do was to tell them what was wrong and they would do the job. But we soon learned that that was not correct, and so we sat together and learned some skills that we never thought we had about bill writing. And when they said they wouldn't do anything about our proposal for a new farm program that would give 100% of parity, we said, all right then, let's administer the current program up to the fullest extent allowed by law. Let's put 90% of parity under the farm economy and go back to essentially the same program that we operated under from 1942 until 1952 under the Stegall Amendment. We knew what that would do, because after the bubble of post-war demand terminated in those years, and many people expected that we would go back into depression, we didn't, because we had the strength of a healthy farm economy underneath our system. We had the only time in the post-war years when we've balanced the federal budget, because there was enough income in the system to make the taxes. We had the lowest inflation rates, the lowest unemployment rates, and the best rate of balanced economic growth that we've had in the post-war years. That, my friends, is what agriculture in a healthy state can do for this country. We monitor the fact that when spread across the land as it is, it has a multiplier that is higher than the multiplier, apparently, that works when other sectors of the economy have an increase in income. And so it puts health in the system in the way that no other sector seems to be capable of doing it. This fall, we made a study. We used the multiplier that was documented at that time. When agricultural income rose, the national income rose by 7 times that amount. And when it went down, the national income fell by 7 times that amount. Now, we don't know that that multiplier still holds. We went to the USDA with our study, and the USDA said, well, we'll accept a multiplier of 5. All right. But let me just give you some idea of what would happen. If we had the same return on investment in agriculture that they have in manufacturing, figures taken from the President's report to the Congress on the state of the economy, and if we had the same return on labor for hours spent in farming that they have in manufacturing and construction, we would have in agriculture $226 billion of what the USDA calls net farm income, which is really not net farm income as any other industry would calculate it. It's return on capital management and labor. They didn't even get to talk about real net farm income or profit yet. In other words, we'd have $200 billion more of net farm income than we in fact have. We have about $30 billion of net farm income. And if you take that multiplier and multiply that out, you find that we would have enough in the tax dollars to pay off the deficit and have $170 billion left over to pay on the national debt, even after you've taken enough money out of that tax surplus and paid it back to the citizens of this country for their increase in the cost of food. Sent them a check from the federal treasury by Social Security number and refunded to them the cost of the increased cost in the price of food that was necessary in order to achieve that increased income that would put the country back on its feet. And we've gone around and taken this study to economists, and we've taken it to the USDA, and they haven't been able to shoot the basic idea underneath that study down. Basically, this winter, we're back in the same place we were 2 years ago. We've got farmers in Washington every week. We're smarter about what's going on and for whose benefit, but we'll never get the job done by ourselves. It continues to depend upon a few farmers who understand, who make it somehow their business to get there day in and day out, to do the educational and the lobbying job, to talk to urban congressmen and senators, and to go to urban people and talk to them about why this is important for the health of the country. But until we get people across this country to recognize the importance of what we're talking about, and some say we can't have parity because it would cost too much, I'd like to point out that parity would only be $70 or $80 billion of net farm income, wouldn't come close to that we'd get if we had equality with the manufacturing sector. So we need more people if we're going to get this job done. We had a question that was published on the front page of our National Agriculture News last week. It was a dumb farmer question. It was the dumbest dumb farmer question that I've ever seen. It asked, how come, Mr. Secretary, we can't have fair prices in world trade for agricultural commodities, because if we had those prices, the buying countries of the world would go somewhere else and buy the grain, and yet we can have an embargo on the Russians because there isn't any other place that they can buy the grain. We're taking cheap American production at less than the cost of production to the American farmer and sending it overseas, and we're undermining the health and stability of those countries. And if the agricultural economy is important to the health of our system, so is it also to all these countries. Now, if that isn't a subversive activity, I don't know what is. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of things that have been said here about ideology. I don't give a damn about ideology. What I care about is truth and people. And people sitting together and figuring out what makes sense for our future on this planet and building together to get that job done. And that's what I hope we're about here. There's a lot of things in relation to the press coverage of our effort that I'd like to go into. I hope we can do it in the question period. Our relationship with other agricultural organizations, the benefit of hindsight on what we've been doing, the kinds of things that have been said by the White House and others that we've worked with. Barry Bosworth, for example, who told us in '78, I'm not sure that Ann wasn't there for that meeting, when he said, we made a mistake. We were paying too much attention to other things. We let the price fall too low. We won't make that a mistake again. We won't give you any money. He was so arrogant that he would say this bald-faced right to our people. But we'll just keep enough price there that you won't ever be able to muster enough strength again to come to Washington. I hope there'll be questions.
Thank you, Don. We have two microphones, one in either aisle. If you have any questions, please come to the microphone and state your question. If the panelists like to question among themselves, they're welcome to do that too.
Before anyone goes to the aisle, What the American agriculture man talked about, I think, was taught to them by a large degree by meetings and so on with Arnold Paulson. You know Arnold Paulson?
I know Arnold.
Arnold Paulson passed away yesterday morning. I thought those of you who knew him would like to know that.
Yes, I'd like Don Patterson to elaborate a little more on what parity would do to food costs, because I don't think people realize what a small amount we're talking about there.
First of all, there's a switch here, I imagine.
It's on.
Is it on? Okay. First of all, in 1978, in the summer, the General Accounting Administration released a report which showed that in the last 5 years, 87% of food price increases occurred after the commodities left the farm. And of the remaining 13%, most of that occurred because of the decline in the value of the dollar, resulting in the need to pay more in dollar terms for imported commodities. Now, if you took a loaf of bread, for example, you'd have right now about 3 cents worth of wheat in a 90-cent loaf of bread. And there was 3 cents worth of wheat when that bread was 30 cents. Farm commodity prices in 1948 per bushel were higher across the board than they were in 1978 in actual dollar terms. And everybody knows what the food price was in 1948 and what's made the difference in the meantime. The farmer's share of the consumer's food dollar is now down to less than 30%. If we had parity for that loaf of bread, we'd have about 5 cents worth of wheat in the loaf. Now, there's a range depending upon the commodity. The problem is not what parity would do by itself to the costs, but that every time there's a price rise, the middleman uses this as an excuse to raise his price, and when the commodity price goes back down, those add-ons never go down. The ratchet effect. And the farmer is continually scapegoated. If you listen to network news, continually scapegoated for a problem that he's not caused. And he's beaten at both ends.
I'm from the West, and I'm trying to figure out why you hear so little about the movements that you've described in the 30s out there. What were the geographic boundaries of something like the farm holiday, and what and why? Why were those the boundaries of it?
The geographic boundaries of the farm holiday and allied organizations basically encompassed the Midwest, plus most of the grain states of the West. There was some little activity in California, but California, I think, already was so heavily into corporate farming that much of the real activist movements in California, and it's an almost untold story, were tremendous farm workers' organizational work and strikes. As to why the movement was confined to the Midwest and to the wheat states of the West, I think it is because basically these were the family-type farms with a relatively high capital investment in them, and these were the type which were threatened by foreclosures. Sharecroppers weren't threatened by foreclosures. There was nothing to foreclose on.
What about the Northwest?
there was some United Farmers League activity in both Washington and Oregon, but I really don't know why there wasn't more in the Northwest. I'm sorry.
There's a question up here.
Yes, I'd like to hear some comment from the panel about the parity program that was set up under the Roosevelt administration, and I'm thinking particularly of the ever-normal granary. I know there's a great deal of skepticism today about the role of the federal government in farm programs, but there was a period of many years, like 20 years, when we did have a good farm program, where the farmers got close to 100% parity, in many major crops, particularly the grain crops. Fred Stover, who's here at the meeting, was one of the architects of that program. And to me, it's always a mystery that the success of this program is not more widely known and discussed. I think in addition to the economic value that the program had, it was administered on a local level by farmer committees, which were the ancestors of the ASCS committees today, I guess. And the whole thing was one of the finest experiments in democracy that the United States has had. But today, it's almost an unknown thing. And I consider it really a great scandal that this program is not known. And I wonder if we could hear some comment from some of the panel members on this program and whether they think it could be reinstituted today.
You know, I'd like to hear directly from the horse's mouth on it. I see Fred Stover sitting here 3 or 4 rows up, and maybe he'd come forward and say something.
I'm sorry, I'm a handicapped person. I got a $400 hearing aid in each ear. I didn't hear the question.
Will the gentleman briefly restate his question, please?
Did you hear it?
He probably can't hear it.
You want us to know why the ever-normal granary, what did succeed, what could succeed, what could be done right now? Great. Would you state your question briefly for him, please? I'm not sure I got the gist of your question.
Well, how about this? Could Fred briefly describe the ever-normal granary, how it operated, why it was crushed, and could it be brought back today?
But that could work. The 1938 Agricultural Adjustment Act is still on the books. That was the authority for the ever-normal granary. Yes, the ever-normal granary could work today. To give a short answer to that question, I'd simply say that the 90% of parity non-recourse loans, which were the undergirding pillar of the whole farm economy during the Roosevelt years, all that would need to be done now is to make that 90% of parity price support loans on storable grains, to make that mandatory instead of permissive as it is now. That's a problem for Carter and Berglund.
And I'd like to point out in relation to that the Stegall Amendment, which brought that 90% of parity into government policy, was the result of the work of Carl Wilkin and working through the Council of Commissioners of Agriculture from the states. They were really the pressure group that brought that about. As Chuck Walters would say, tells it in the book Unforgiven. I wish that book would be brought into print. Incidentally, we need that book. But it took the War Appropriation Act they convinced the Congress that it could be done, but it is suspected that probably Roosevelt would have vetoed that bill if it hadn't been tied to the War Appropriations Bill, and he couldn't veto that. But there was at least some thinking at that time that at least in order to protect the food supply during the war years, we had to make sure that farmers made a living. So they reversed the pattern of thinking that had been so strong for so long, that the way to make the country healthy economically was to squeeze surplus labor, surplus fiber, and surplus food out of the rural economy and into the industrial economy.
I'd like to state if any of the old veterans from previous farm strikes would like to speak or contribute to our discussion about something we haven't touched on, something they'd like to specifically state, please feel free to do so. There's a question up here.
Yeah, I have a question for Don. One of the common objections to a parity program in 1980 is that it would help large farmers at the expense of small farmers. Could you address that question?
I'm glad to have you ask it. A lot of our farmers in American ag are bigger than they would just as soon be because they've had to get bigger in order to hang on in the squeeze that has occurred and that has made it so that you take advantage of tax and investment credit laws in order to, with borrowed money, rather than being able to make a living on farming. And so we want to get the income back so that you can make a living from the farming aspect at efficient scale of operation, point number one. We feel that it's important immediately to get price back into agriculture. That will not solve all the structure problems in agriculture. And our long-term bill, and there are copies of that on the literature table that I've set up out there, it's called the Economic Recovery Act of 1978. That's an old version. There's been some modifications, but not very many. And for those that are interested, you can get the idea of what we're talking about. And in that, there's a provision that calls for non-farm corporations to divest themselves and gives them 5 years to do it. So that there are other provisions that need to be done to maintain the sensible structure of agriculture at this point. Price alone, over the longer term, will not accomplish it, but price is basic right now to getting health back into our economy, and the benefits of that will be so great that the fact that a few fat dogs over here might be able to eat out of the dish of the starving should not stop us from taking the action we need to take for our own good. In other words, this red herring has been drawn across the path to immobilize the forces that we need in order to get the job done.
There's a question up here on the left.
I just want to make a brief comment about Don's remark about the terms of the farmer only getting 3 cents out of the product. The insanity of the whole system is now that you can, cereal I think is about the same in terms of the money that the farmer gets, is that you can take the coupon out of the bottom of the box and it says right on there that the grocer gets a nickel for handling that piece of paper and simply returning it to the manufacturer. And one wonders what would happen if consumers, instead of sending the coupons to the grocery store, began sending them back to the farmer and tell the farmer to cash them because he's going to get more money out of the coupon than he's going to get out of the product.
I'd just like to say one more thing on the structure aspects. Investment and tax credit laws, which are designed to stimulate the economy, are having very adverse effects on the structure of agriculture in giving people with outside cash flow a better after-tax bottom line than the working family farmer has. And that's the problem that we've got to do something about in relation to people who can take cash flow. I saw in the paper the other day where Maytag is looking for something to do with its excess profits. These kinds of things, and incidentally, I have a clipping from the Chicago Tribune that Lowell cut out, which is one of the best pieces of journalism that I've seen in the last couple of years on just this question, how to save the nation's family farms from big landowners. I had 50 copies of it Xerox this morning, so that because a number of people had asked for it, and if any of you would like, I have a stack of them here available afterward.
I'd like to ask Mr. Walters.
Yep.
Let me
Chuck, I have a
comment
comment.
on that too. There's another aspect in the structure of the farm. It has been the aim of the land-grant colleges for many, many years to build machines and technologies that the family farm can't afford to have or compete against. That's a public policy matter, and that needs changing too.
Let me just say to wrap up on that, what's happening is that we got sold a bill of goods on that, and they've got us wired in to these practices for the life of that equipment. And right now, what's happening in my state is that equipment at farm sales is going on the block, and nobody wants it. And the prices are way off on large equipment. And George Naylor told me that the same thing is happening in Iowa. And right now, farm values in some areas are beginning to fall. We're right on the edge of it.
There's a question up here on the right.
I'd like to ask Mr. Walters to give a real brief explanation of the Committee for Economic Development and their 1960 or 1961 report. But what I'd like to hear most is, I know that right following the release of that report, there was very strong reaction from NFO, NFU, the Grange. Hearings were held. It seemed like there was a lot of opposition coming from farm sectors to that. But then all of a sudden it dropped out of sight. And the question that I'm most interested in is, what happened to that protest? What happened to that opposition? Did it get put down, snuffed out? Did people just forget about it? And if you have any insights about what that might help us in thinking of our strategies for the future.
Well, first of all, the Committee for Economic Development is sort of a sub-club of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a blood brother of the Trilateral Commission. Basically, the report of the early 60s accomplished its goals in 4 years instead of 5. It was a 5-year plan for agriculture to move farmers out of agriculture. That's simple. Once the thing had run its course, of course, the criticism of it had spent itself too. People sometimes come unglued, especially commentators. They say, well, you people got conspiracy on the brain and so on. No, there's no conspiracy. These papers are published. They're put on the library shelves of the universities. They're sent out to all the economists on the registry of the American Economic Association, the American Economic Association. We get all these papers. There's no conspiracy when you tell them what you're going to do, publish a blueprint of how you're going to do it, give it to them, and then they refuse to read it. But that is exactly what's going on, and it has gone on without let up ever since approximately the early 50s. I remember we discussed in NFO, and I explained why you could not hold cattle effectively. Because out of the University of Oklahoma and Texas and the other land-grant colleges came the computer studies that structured the feedlot system. 20, 40, 80,000 head under one lot, out of control of the farmer, to be finished off, assuring the slaughtering houses a steady supply. How are you going to hold against a thing like that, you see? And every move that the farmers have made out here, they've been checkmated by the land-grant colleges with their super sophisticated professors and their tax-paid computer equipment. They're always about a jump or two ahead of everybody in the organization. Hell, there's more professors get into one meeting figuring out how to screw the farmers than you get in this meeting here.
Question on the left over here.
Yes, I just wanted to make a couple of small, short comments, and that is, during the holiday movement, we worked for cost of production. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in that sense because I know that the prices that we set, say, whether it's parity or cost of production, depends on who's pushing the pencil. But I wanted to point this out because if you take the parity figures from year to year, from 1910 to 1914, we said that parity wasn't a range figure. This is why we opposed it and we pushed for cost of production. But if you take the figures that are listed in U.S. Farm News or in this bulletin here, parity, then you will find that if you separate the two periods, say from 1910 to 14 up to 1938, because in February of 1938 is when the Agricultural Adjustment Act cleared the courts and became legal, so I took that to separate it. Then you will find that from 1910 to 1938, the average price, according to the parity figure, true parity figure, the farmer received 90 and 5/10% of parity. And then if you take from 1938 through 1977, I think it is, then you'll find that the farmer got an average return of 85 and 5/10% of parity. So you see what they've been doing to us progressively, in spite of the fact that they have the parity formula and they kept shifting this. And I just wanted to make those two comments.
First of all, may I comment on that? First of all, parity is not an arranged figure. It is not an arranged figure. It is a measuring device. It is a computation system. It's an index. Now, what really happened is when they passed the Farm Act in 1948, they put into it a provision that changed the base period every 10 years. So every 10 years, they moved back the all commodities index, the other indexes, back to what, regardless of what they are, they move them up and call it 100 and start over again. And then they keep a Mickey Mouse game going that says we've got this in terms of 1910, 1914 as adjusted to such and such. And even in the 30s, they only had about half of the commodities using 1910-14 as a base period equals 100. Most of these base periods were Mickey Moused around all over the place. And I'm absolutely convinced that they stepped off of the premises used by Dr. Wheeler when he came up with the parity formula to so discredit the thing till eventually we came up with the slogan, parity is dead. At the same time, we had the slogan, God is dead.
We have time for two more questions. One on the right.
Let me just say
sure.
one more thing in relation to that.
I didn't mean, I'm not trying to dispute what you said. I'm just said that's what happened during the period, and this is what we fought for. And as a matter of fact, I was trying to dig it up before I came here. And an economist figured out at that period of time that the figures they used from 1910 to 14, that gave the farmer a parity figure, sure, but it represented 50% of the national average income.
The index is based upon a market basket of things that farmers have to buy, for those who are not aware, for both living and for production inputs. But the American agriculture movement made a policy decision to accept the revised, so-called revised parity numbers, 1968 base, so that when we talk about parity, we're not talking about the 10 to 14, which would be higher commodity prices, but we're talking about the 1968 base that is the commonly accepted parity index right now existing. Also, the cost of production was mentioned. We had, in the winter of '78, a lot of discussion because congressmen and senators kept saying, get off of parity and use something else, because the word is you never get anything on the basis of parity. People think it's a subsidy and so on. And so we had farmers who were saying, well, we'll replace it with a cost of production index. And I, for one, I guess along with a majority on the delegate body, and that was the most incredibly compelling experience in grassroots democracy that I ever hoped to participate in. The national delegate body of the American agriculture met in a number of places, but mostly in the swimming pool penthouse of the Capitol Hill Quality Inn every single night for about 4 months thrashing through the policy by which and the tactics by which the movement was going to be guided. You get to know people pretty well, and you network pretty effectively when you work with people from every state in the Union that closely. But one of the arguments that came up from some states was, well, let's go ahead with cost of production. What happens when you replace parity with an average cost of production is that you've got a bell curve, and every year that average changes so that you progressively drive out farmers at the low end, and you've got a different average next year until, what have you got left? 1. And they wanted to snooker us over onto that idea because they knew that once they hook us on an average cost of production policy base, the battle's won. It's just a question of time.
I think I misunderstood. I didn't mean to change it from parity to cost of production. I merely wanted to point out, and I said that when I made my remarks, that it depends on who's pushing the pencil.
Well, there's one thing you've got to remember. We were dumping milk in 1967. And yet that's the very period that we're told is 100 right now. Now this year, at some point in time, later on this year, it will be moved forward in 1977, 78. I think 77 will be the period, and they say it was at 100% of parity then. You see the fraud involved?
Yeah.
This is complicated subjects, you know, and people say, well, you can't include the idea of productivity increase in parity. I say any other business, when it has a productivity increase, it takes entrepreneurship to win that increase, and they call it profit. And they allow that in any other industry. But in agriculture, they want to take away the returns to entrepreneurship that resulted in those increases in productivity. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, you have to have those returns ultimately, or we don't have the farming, the type of farming economy that is optimal in this country.
You know, farm strikes are a time when, more than any other time, national attention is turned to highlight the problems that farmers are facing. We have over a century here of farm strikes that we're talking about now. My question is, what kind of educational vehicles or ways to educate that farmers who are involved in these strikes use to educate their neighbors, their church organizations, to highlight, while attention was turned to the issue, to explain to people who weren't directly involved in it what kind of problems the farmers were facing from, you know, back then to now, briefly if we can. I know time is running out.
Can you hear me? I'd like to answer that. First, we got to go back to the communities. I want to relay something which happened, how you can organize people. Back in Texas, 10 days ago, I think it was at Raymondville, Texas, a family brought a man to the hospital. They refused to take him in and send him to Harlingen. He died on the way from a heart attack. What I'm trying to point out is answer this lady's question. Go back to your communities, start checking with your neighbors, find out some of the things that are going on, and you start from there. The other thing is, I'm just bringing it, relating this. I understand in many hospitals today, unless you can deposit $100 in cash, not a check, you cannot be permitted in the hospital. It's about time we get back home. We got to start at the grassroots level. We got to bring the issues that are right at our doors, with our neighbors, with our churches, with our communities, and that's how we organize people.
I think that's a good note to stop on. We'd like to have Larry ask his question, but maybe we can ask it after the session here. I'd like to thank all the panel members for being on this panel. I've enjoyed it. I think we've all enjoyed it. And if you have any other questions, please ask them in the hallway later.
Last summer, I went to a Rural America conference, and Bob Berglund came in and gave a speech, and then people lined up at the microphone to ask him a question, and I stood in line for about 20 minutes, and I finally got to the mic, and he said goodbye and walked out of the room. And I don't like to play Bob Berglund, but if I have a regret about the conference, it's that I can't keep all of you together for 2 weeks. I mean, the knowledge and the experience that are here is something that I would like to be able to tap into for a long time, but we do have to move on, and I'm just hoping that we can all persevere. The people are available, and the next panel will allow discussions of similar issues related to parity and pricing of agricultural commodities. I have an announcement that lunch is going to be brought into here in sacks, and then it'll